Okay, so my presentation is going to be on the fog of war, and this book was really interesting. I mean, it talks about the life and lessons of Robert S. McNamara, and it was also made into a movie. But the book is written by James G. Blight and Janet M. Lang, and it's a really brilliant book. It really gives you an insight about what it was like back in the day, back during those times of tragedy, back in the 1960s, which was the time where the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War was going on back then. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the prologue was talking about film and how it was a brilliant piece of art. And it not only showed the fact of, they didn't only show the perspective of McNamara's experience, but it also gave us insight as to how to prevent these things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War from happening, which I think was really important in some of the events that occurred later on, like 9/11, and I think it's really critical. I think Trump needs to, look back on this, read this book, and look back on how we can interpret this kind of thinking into, things like school shootings and stuff like that, gun control, because this gun control is a really big issue, but, anyway. So these so-called decision makers are the ones that take risks in making sure that they make the right decision as to how the U.S. needs to, act during the invasions that were occurring. So let's see. Revelations can also indicate that the decision makers were mistaken in critical respect, but those mistakes might have even led to the tragedy that happened during that time. So it really was critical that decision makers back then were as spot on as possible. And sometimes they made mistakes, sometimes they were human, and sometimes they led to tragedy, but I'm sure they worked through it, and they did a good job of making sure that nothing else happened. So the prologue also talks about this method of critical oral history, and so McNamara's preparation for the interviews with Oral Morris was done primarily with his participation in the critical oral history projects on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred between so this interview was occurring between 1987 and 2002, and this model also helps him with the escalation of the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about later. But so historians don't really like to deal with counterfactual. So never mind. This book was also really good at talking about McNamara and how he felt about this stuff during the time that this stuff was going on. And it really, really gives you an insight as to how these things were accomplished and everything else. And find the right page. So I got these marked too, so I have a pain in the butt to get to. So, since the prologue has been written, over 1,300 soldiers died, and over 100,000 Iraqis have died as a result of this Vietnam War. So, like I said, a lot of lives, this was a really tragic time back in those days. So that's it for the prologue, and we'll get right into the chapter 1. So chapter 1 talks a lot about. So these chapters kind of bounce off between Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in 1962, attacks on both Cuba and Turkey were going to involve missiles if Kennedy didn't resolve the crisis immediately. So Kennedy was really on edge at this time. He was really nervous, and he was just, he's one of those guys that was like, didn't want to deal with it, but, it was horrible. Robert McNamara points out that empathy has nothing to do with sympathy. So if you read the beginning of the book, if you read with the lesson 1, it states that emphasize with your neighbor is critical if you want to understand what your enemy is trying to do. So in this case, Kennedy was trying to emphasize with what Cuba was trying to do during this missile crisis. Robert also reports that this guy named Nikita Khrushchev's letter to John F. Kennedy, which occurred in 1962 during this time, he felt that this was really written by a bunch of hardliners, and he also stated that this letter that he wrote was either written by a man that was drunk, or some kind of man that was just stressed out. And believe me, I'm sure that he was really stressed out. And one of the lines of the letters here is so John F. Kennedy writes to Nikita Khrushchev that if people do not display wisdom, they will eventually reach a point where they will clash like blind moles, and then mutual annihilation will commence. So actually it was Khrushchev who was writing this to John F. Kennedy. But yeah, you can tell by that writing that he was really either stressed out or he was just drunk off his butt. So moving on with the Vietnam War. This is jumping back to the Johnson administration. So by this time, Kennedy has been like assassin, and now we're worried about this Vietnam War. And during this time, in 1967, Lyndon B. Johnson deploys 500,000 Americans to South Vietnam, and this prime minister called Ho Chi Minh, if I'm saying that right, so he wants to stop the U.S. bombing completely. And Johnson feels that he is being irrational and just being a total, jerk and everything. And so the moral of this chapter is that empathy is a key element in finding success and failure in foreign policy making. So in order for these presidents to make the right decision, they really had to make sure that they knew what their enemy was trying to do, which I think was really, it's kind of a really good, key point in, making sure none of those tragedies happened again. So with that, we'll move on to chapter 2. So chapter 2, the Cuban Missile Crisis has been discussed for more than 3 days. This is still in 1962 during the Kennedy administration. And just before the speech, Kennedy had given the public info on the crisis during his speech at the during his October 22nd speech, which really informed the nation about the crisis. So during this meeting with his advisors, they really tried to come up with 3 broad options that would, hopefully help the situation. One of those options was take the case to the UN Security Council, which nobody was in favor of, because they believed that this action would force the Soviets to remove the missiles, which would not be good. So they also had a second option, which would be a quarantine, which would be a blockade of Cuba, which just would block equipment from coming there and going back, as this would prevent men from getting to the island, which would get tightened and which could lead to more decisive military action. So they really, off the bat, they just really wanted to make sure that this option did not occur. And the third option was the air attack against the missile sites, which all three of these options. Sorry, I'm trying to talk and breathe at the same time. But Kennedy was really on edge, like I said before, and his entire Joint Chiefs of Staff were really in favor of the option 3. But Kennedy felt that it was too risky and felt like a nuclear attack was the best bet for the U.S. if the Soviets were bound to a reprisal. So this guy named Castro really thought that Cuba should be either destroyed for no reason or be destroyed but be redeemed by the total destruction of his nemesis. And he also concluded that an airstrike was inevitable. So you can tell that Kennedy is just really getting stressed out by this point, and he's just really, it's just really on edge. So moving on with chapter 3. Now this is going back to the Vietnam War. So Lyndon B. Johnson approves the National Security Action Memorandum, which would assist the people and the government in South Vietnam to win their contest against the externally directed and supported communist conspiracy. It was later changed to O-Plan, Operational Plan, and which would play an important role in the events in the Tonkin Gulf. So Americans started to see this Johnson president as an uncomfortable, nervous wreck as the world war is still going on, which I understand because, you know, you got thousands of people dying in this Vietnam place, and it's like there's nothing he can do. He's on the other side trying to figure out what to do. So by that time, McNamara is the first U.S. senior official to actually visit one of the main guys of the Vietnam War, which was Hanoi, if I'm saying that right. And he was told by this guy that he and the Johnson administration have been wrong about two key issues. One of those issues is the August 2nd attack, which was how the U.S. destroyed the Maddox that was attacked by the North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. They were issued by a local commander, and he also stated that the August 4th attack, which was the attack before midnight, was never occurred, which just kind of really got under Johnson's skin, and he didn't know what to do. So sorry if I'm kind of jumping kind of ahead. You know, I'm trying to slow down, but at the same time, this is kind of trying to go as fast as I can here. So chapter 4 goes into the Second World War, which is referred to as the Good War, but it's really ironic because the Good War happened to be one of the world's most catastrophic war in human history. And he also talks about the Pacific War, which was persuasive racism on both American side and the Japanese side. McNamara told Errol Morris, this Morris guy is also the film director, that he analyzed bombs to be more effective, more efficient. Not so more efficient in the sense of killing men, but more efficient in the weakening of the adversary. But this one bombing called the XX-1 bombing, this was a really tragic bombing because 16 square miles were destroyed and almost 8 to 100,000 people were killed. And this guy named General Curtis Lee May said that the citizens of Tokyo had been scorched and boiled and baked to death. which I believe that's true, because that's a pretty big bombing when you think about it. And it was just a tragic time back in those days. So it's just. Oh. So this is another long slide, but I'll try to go as quickly as I can. Between 1954 and 1973, the U.S. neither succeeded nor gave up its fully, which cost them more than 3 million Vietnamese lives, 58,000 American lives, and it also cost them billions and billions of dollars. So evidence suggests that John F. Kennedy really did re-examine his reasoning to go into war in Vietnam, and he may also have decided to be responsible for deciding that U.S. soldiers be withdrawn from the Vietnam War completely. He didn't want any of his soldiers being anything to do with this war, which I understand. And he also said America under Kennedy must be prepared to pay any price and bear any burden on the behalf of the American people. So Kennedy, in his inaugural speech to the American public, said, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger." So moving on to midnight of April 17th, 1961, over 1,200 Cuban exiles arrived at the Bay of Pigs, which was on the south coast of Cuba, and their goal was to establish a beachhead and hold it against a counterattack by the Army Militia and the military of Cuban government forces, which were led by Castro. This is considered to be one of the most humiliating event in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, Kennedy was just humiliated. So the invader, he was humiliated because the invaders who survived were in prison and subject to a public show trial, quote unquote, in Havana. And this was just really getting under his skin. You can tell by Kennedy's letters to him that he was not happy. So by the fall of the same year, Kennedy responds plea to communism in South Vietnam by many of his advisors, and after April of 1961, Kennedy never accepted unquestionably advice from his intelligence and military advisors ever again, which I can respect, because he was done, because there was no way to do anything. He wanted them guys to get out of there as quickly as possible, which I understand. So, moving on with chapter 6. So this is basically just an overview of what McNamara shares in his philosophy. And he shares that something about dealing with the press. He says that don't answer the question they ask, but answer the question you wish they asked. So this is coming from the former Secretary of Defense, which really, he has a good point there. McNamara was an early advocate of escalation when it came to the Vietnam War. He came to realize all the flaws in the American approach way before any colleagues did. So this guy was really smart. He was one of those guys that knew what was going on, knew how to handle it, and he knew it before anybody else figured it out. And he also never apologized for the Vietnam War at all to the Vietnamese or the American people. And shortly after 23 years of interviews, phone calls, and meals, Oral Morris had grown to like McNamara and his triads against him. And he also, he must have liked him because he wrote a movie about him. So, moving on with the epilogue, which the epilogue really gets into this book called Wilson's Ghost, and it provides a considerable insight into what makes McNamara tick. McNamara had conveyed a good deal of essence in less than 2 chapters in the book. This chapter called it's 2 pages in the book. No, sorry, I'm trying to jumping over words here, but this chapter called the Manifesto was a really good insight as to what was making McNamara do what he did. And so the 20th century produced a lot of bloodbath of war and destruction, but it also helped our success of saving, lengthening, and improving lives, because we realized that war really did kill lives, and it helped us really figure out that how we can prevent this tragedy from happening again. So this one guy called Albert Schweitzer won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. He was a musician, scholar, and crusader for saving and improving the lives of his fellow human beings. So he had this philosophy called the reverence of life, which he practiced in Africa. And it was really, really important in how to improve the lives of many Americans. So moving on with Appendix A. So two important dates. This is kind of like a timeline. So two important dates we want to address here. So December of 1960. So McNamara joins the Kennedy administration as the Secretary of Defense, and he is the youngest person to hold that position. And also in October of 1963, he recommends the plans to withdraw military personnel from South Vietnam by the end of 1965. And Kennedy actually was the one that approved this, so really it was McNamara who had the idea of withdrawing the military personnel from South Vietnam, which, good for him. Appendix B doesn't really give a whole insight on anything, just gives us a brief, more insight and exploration of each chapter. But what's interesting about what I got out of this is the fact that history yields plenty of lessons, but some are contradictory. So history does give us a lot of lessons, but they also can, give us tragedy as well. But anyway, I also got my references right here. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and hope you learned something. Hopefully, if you didn't, I encourage you to read this Fog of War book. It's a great book if you want to learn more about what it was like during our history and during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. So, again, thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed.